So our last talk before lunch will be Haylee Mills from Splunk, our first of 2 Splunk talks today. Many organizations have had the experience of drowning in alerts, but we need to figure out what's important to us and what's likely to be a real risk to our enterprise. Next talk is going to share with us the concept of risk-based alerting and helping us be alerted on what's important. Get a round of applause. Haylee Mills. Scepter. You're the big one.
All right, but also it's not going to the next slide. That's the laser. Oh God, the green button. Okay. There's 2 green buttons and one's a laser. So we're just going to talk about what I'm talking about with risk-based alerting, so we're all sort of on the same page as to what that is. And then we'll talk about how you can do that, so you can implement it in whatever tool you have. And then when you have that implemented, what can you do with that? So the problem is that we often have a great MITRE technique data source like command line, but really, really difficult to craft alerts. And the reason is we don't want to get murdered by the SOC. They already have enough alerts to deal with, and we don't want to add to that. So risk-based alerting is a great way to deal with that. A story time about myself. I was a SOC analyst for a while, and I was drowning in alerts like we all tend to be. And in 2018 at Splunks.conf, I watched a talk by Jim Apker of Splunk and Stuart McIntosh of Outpost Security talking about risk-based alerting. And I was like white-knuckling my seat because I could see the potential. And like when I got back, I just wanted it implemented right away. So when I got back, I tried to do that, but it took a while of convincing to make sure that we could make it happen. But what we were able to do is reduce alert volume by 90%, which sounds wild, but I believe I've seen those numbers over and over when someone implements risk-based alerting, and also increase alert fidelity from 1% to nearly 10. And not just that we're like pigeonholing on the we reduced 90% of alerts and that's what's left, but more that I think the issue with a lot of detection is we have these alerts that just keep making more and more alerts. So we kind of have blinders on the detections that we're looking at. And instead we want to look at all of the noise and just sort of observe those things happening and then alert when we see a bunch of interesting observations together. And we were able to cover huge swaths of the attack framework. And actually we wanted to build RBA in 2019 after I got back from the conference in 2018. And I told everyone about it. Everyone was mostly on board, but the voices from on high just wanted 100% of the MITRE attack framework covered, which is not how you're supposed to utilize that, but that's what we did. So our little rebellion was to just post in a lot of JIRAs, we'll build this next year with RBA. We'll build this next year with RBA. And so that's what we did. And the next year we were able to dedicate some engineering time to sort of reorganize how we were alerting. And then we also got incredible value from purple teams because we actually caught red team during the development of RBA when we only had 15 or 20 rules in place, but because we were detecting on the type of subtle lull band, lull bass stuff that they were doing, we were actually able to catch them then. And then I took a screenshot of their activity, sent it to them, and be like, hey, what are you up to, bud? And got that conversation going. And then we were able to sort of have these back and forths of having them test, see what risk they generate, and then rebuilding a bunch of content, and then detecting again. And the amount of risk they created was so much more that we would detect them so much earlier in the attack lifecycle. And then lastly, one thing I really like about this is the view into behavior that you're getting by tracking the objects and what your objects are doing. So you can use that for large swaths of adjusting rules, but you can also view it as a lens to see trends or anomalies, and also potentially as a type of threat hunting queue because you're looking at noisy things. So over different time frames, you can see patterns that arise with those different lenses. So the detection methodology for far too long has been, you've got a log source, you build some detection logic, and then you pop out an alert on the other side. And The problem with that is that as you increase visibility, you're just increasing volume. And like if you were going for 100% of the MITRE ATT&CK framework with this methodology, you would end up with 100 analysts to work the amount of alerts you're generating from that type of thing. So what we're switching to is relatively simple. It's not like a wild idea, but you're just taking that log source, and then I like to think of it as observation logic. I just want to see something that's interesting, something I might want to know about. So that could be like registry keys created in startup locations. It could be common recon commands, AD finds, and lull bins are great because they happen in a normal environment so often that, but now I just want to know every time it happens. Not alert, just know that it happened. And we throw that into what we call a risk index, but it's just an abstraction layer where everything's sharing the same field language. So on top of that, when that event occurs and we observe it, we might want to throw on some security metadata. So you'd use a risk score. You can also use the MITRE ATT&CK tactic and technique, and then just the log source that it's coming from. So you can see like things coming from multiple log sources. And then on top of that, we can also tweak the risk score by attributes about the risk object. So for example, asset priority, if it has any crit vulns on the machine, or if that user is an outlier doing that type of activity in your environment. And then we are grouping that into like a bucket. So now I like to think of like each object, like a user or a system in your environment, like having a bucket that you're just storing observations in over and over. And then we're grouping that together and alerting on the interesting observations that are in that bucket. So I've got some sample events here. Most of those things I couldn't alert on in my enterprise when I built this out, but you can see I've got the MITRE tactic and technique. I've got an assigned score and the source type. And so if we were to group this in our little abstraction layer and throwing it into our risk index by object, then it's like each object is looking at all of your detections, no matter what they are, and then just alerting when there's enough interesting things there. So for example, we could use the score. That's classic. So over 24 hours, we could see that these events together generated a score over 100. Throw an alert to the SOC to investigate. And now they've got like a list of activities. So it's kind of telling a security story. I love the last talk. And now I want to do a whole new talk on storytelling with this type of alerting. But you could also do, for example, events from multiple source types over 3 days, or I mean, really any time frame. But this was actually our highest performing alert, that when we went from like 800 to 1400 alerts per week to 80 to 120, we would get maybe 0 to 10 of these per week, but they were very high fidelity because it's very uncommon for like someone from HR to pop something from NetFlow, IDS, web, and EDR or something along those lines. So we really love that alert. And then we could also look at multiple MITRE tactics observed over 7 days. So you could see these same events would potentially be caught in a more spread out time frame. So the requirements, as far as I know, I'm sure there are other creative ways of solving this this problem, but you want to be able to tie events from all sources into an abstraction layer that has shared field language. And I'll go over a risk generating rule and see how we utilize those shared fields. In Splunk's SPL, that is the collect command that like brings things into a new index that you can search. And in enterprise security, that's the risk analysis action attached to correlation searches. And then you need to be able to define a risk score and add security metadata to these observations when you're throwing it into that new source type. And with SPL, that would be the eval command, or you could utilize risk factors in enterprise security. And lastly, you need to be able to tweak those scores up and down based on the attributes of that risk object that you're assigning the observation to. So in SPL, that's the lookup command, and in ES, that would be the identity and asset lookup, as well as a combination of risk factors. So let's build our risk rule, starting with the skeleton. So we're just going to look at our suricata data to start in our IDS index. And we're just statsing basically a table of the source IP, dest IP, and signature, along with the category of the alert that came through and the signature of the alert. And then we're just going to, based on the category, we're going to assign a risk score. So The way we were basically assigning risk scores was like a combination of impact and fidelity or confidence. So if something would be really, really bad to see, we might pop up the impact, but the fidelity is low. We don't see it very often, so we might lower it a little bit. But this was able to give like huge swaths of these IDS signatures. We had 35,000 signatures, and they weren't contributing this like context to work with our other alerts. It was just really, really noisy. And the only things we really had enabled were things we had seen by Red Team in the past and just sort of whitelisted our normal business activity. But I also left a little space there because another thing I like to do is to add informational risk observations. So in this case, if the signature started with ET info or ET pro info, I would just make this category info field so that I could assign a 0 risk score to that, just so that I have the observation tracked. And once you have that tracked, you can do a lot of that broad tuning when you see what's sort of firing that informational alert. But you also, you could tune it out if it's really regular business traffic and it's very specific, but you can also just observe it every time it happens because that context can be useful with other things. And then on top of that, we'll add some muscles to our risk rules. So that's just that shared field language. So we use the terminology of risk object and threat object, risk object being the thing that you are protecting and threat object being the thing that it does or the behavior that it has. So in this case, I've got a source IP. I'm identifying it as a system. But if you have other data, like in proxy data, you might have the user and the host name. So you'd apply risk to both objects because if there's any sort of pivoting going on, you'd still be tracking to something, the shared sort of risk language. And then with the threat object, we have a dest IP in this case, and marking it as an IP. But that could be a domain, a file hash, registry key, file name, command line, whatever is the thing that your thing is doing, just so you can look at it later and you can either use that for tuning or, again, threat hunting. And then we'll just add the source type as well as the event time. We're just doing that because you want the actual time of the event to follow through with the new alert that you're going to build after this. And then we'll throw a risk message and a risk info field. I sort of see this risk message being like a general idea of what's happening, enough to sort of tell that story. So if you saw all the alerts in order, you could see like IDS alert to this, EDR alert to that. But don't make it too unique, like adding the timestamp, because if you were going to dedupe this and just only look at uniques later, you would want some way to sort of just, like, you don't want to see the same thing alerting 500 times and each time it adds risk. So the risk message field is a great way to sort of tune that down. And then the risk information field, just really anything you want to pass forward to the analyst so they don't have to go directly to the raw logs to find interesting context. And for example, with proxy, we would include the user agent, the URL, bytes in, bytes out, that type of stuff, just so they had it handy when they were investigating. And lastly, the star of the show is the Miti Attack tactic and technique. You can see based on the category, I'm assigning a different technique. And again, this is a broad brush, but it at least gives that observation some context so it can play well with other alerts. And lastly, we'll throw a skin on there. So in this case, I'm looking up an asset list and then providing the host name if I have it, as well as the priority and the category. And this next slide is not that scary. It's just starting with a count of 0. And then if in the category I see PCI, go ahead and throw 1 on that 0. Otherwise, leave it alone. If I see production, add 1, otherwise leave it alone. If I see database, add 1, otherwise leave it alone. And priority and critical or high, same thing. And then on top of that, a fun thing you can do is add that vuln data. So if you had a lookup of your hosts with the number of crit vulns on those machines, you could combine that crit vuln count with the modification count you just made from this and make a new count. And again, with users, you could do something like executives, executive assistants. You could base it on the admin rights they have, or anything you can think of that would make sense to elevate their scoring automatically. I know for insider risk people, a lot of, like if there's a watch list or someone's about to be terminated, they just add risk so that those insider threat alerts are more likely to bubble up as an alert. And then we just take our normal risk score we would have assigned and then multiply it by that risk modification count that we've adjusted by 0.25, just because if something makes 50 risk, you don't want it to make necessarily 200 risk out of the box, but just you can tweak that number. And I like to think, like with risk, you're working with an ecology, sort of, like you have this sort of environment that plays with itself. So rather than just direct alerts where you're just tuning that alert, you get these opportunities to like tweak aspects of the whole system and then see how it responds to your tweaks. And then it just ends with a collect command. That's just throwing it into a new index, so you can search on that index for your alerts, and we'll do that in the next slide. But just to review what we've got here as far as fields goes, we've got the risk score that we applied at the very beginning. Then we've got the risk object and the type. We've got the threat object and the type. We've got the source type and the event time. And we've got that general risk message along with additional info we might want to include in the risk info field. And then we've got that good Miti Attack data. But you can also use any cybersecurity framework, CIS-20, Lockheed Martin kill chain, even build your own. I know that Miti is working on an insider threat kill chain, so that's how I've seen people use it before, of like collection, reconnaissance, exfiltration type things. And then we build our alert. So that's the basis of the alerting. You don't have as many of these. You have a ton of risk generating rules, but then you'd really just have a handful of these types of like gathering alerts. So we're just looking at our risk index and then popping out distinct number of tactics, distinct number of techniques, distinct sources, and sum the risk score by our risk objects. And that generates all three of those alerts we used in the example. So we've got the risk score over 100 for the 24 hours. We've got the distinct number of sources above 2. We've got the distinct count of MITRE tactics above 2, or distinct number of MITRE techniques, as well as distinct source types above 1, just because if an attacker is stuck in sort of one part of the chain, you could still detect them because you're seeing things from multiple source types firing in that area. So on top of that, I mentioned this earlier, that like we generally utilized just like one alert over a certain time period for each one of those things. But again, you could do a risk score of say 300 over 3 days, or you could do distinct source types over 5 days, or MITRE attack over 30 days. And each one of these gives like a different picture of your environment that, again, you can use for tuning and sort of seeing those behaviors that pop out, those threat objects that are really, really common. And so you can just tweak levers here and there. You can, allow list as far as you'd like with really specific business traffic. But I really like the idea of hanging on to these observations so we can make comparisons and do the anomaly tracking type stuff as well. And so just about rethinking how we do detection, because we're just looking for observations, I can store anything I might want to know about later and just make the risk score 0. So a few examples of how we utilize this. This was actually a favorite of mine from one of our SOC analysts. You know who you are. And his idea was to make a risk rule that makes a 0 risk event when Adobe Acrobat spawns a web browser. We had to do some allow listing for like normal internal business traffic, opening internal PDFs and that type of thing, but also in conjunction with a proxy connection to an uncategorized site. And also you could, for example, look for an HTTP post or something like that, but those things within a 10-minute time frame, each one of these alerts fired thousands of times per day, but in conjunction happened very rarely. And usually it was only when people were being phished. And we would often see like the alert come in, they would work the alerts, about to reset the user's password, and then the user reports it to the phishing queue because they realized that they did get phished. So that was one of my favorite rules. My favorite rule that I made was looking for all these recon commands, whomI, netstat, ipconfig, so on and so forth. And some of those I did assign more than 0 risk to, because impact and confidence, some of those things were happening so rarely in our environment that I might just throw like 10, 15, 20, like not a terrible amount, so that it wouldn't alert by itself. But then I made another rule to look for when any of those fired. And then I could say add maybe 25 risk when I see 3, maybe 50 risk when I see 5, but maybe like 90 when I see 7 of those, because who is doing all 7 of those commands in any sort of small time frame? And so this was really great for catching red team. And so, and shells in general. After we built this and red team realized they had to get around my crafty little detection, then they started building fileless in-memory like shells so that our EDR wouldn't catch the command lines. And then we had to evolve by starting to look at network traffic and making risk rules about network traffic and the types of things that indicate C2. So it's just so exciting, the possibilities of like complex detections, and I'm excited to see the cat and mouse game sort of evolve these detections even further. So as far as alerting goes, one thing I really like about Risk is that you can have different lenses into this data. Like, we initially approached this for SOC, but also we had people in DLP, in database, in insider risk who like saw the potential for the approach, but it necessarily wasn't for SOC. We really just added eval for SOC equals 1, for insider equals 1, and then had their own alerts that just looked at their own risk events. And what was really great about this was that so often as a content engineer, like people would come with a request like, we've got this log source and we've got an audit requirement for security. Can you please do security on it? And a lot of the times we really couldn't, because they wanted to know like every failed login and just a lot of things that were really, really noisy. So we would often just sort of send them a report and like, good luck, I hope that helps kind of thing. But it didn't really feel like you're enabling the business. And so what was great about this was like they would come with their log source and we would talk to them like, what do you, like we would explain the RBA concept and the buckets and be like, well, what do you think would indicate compromise? Like, what sort of things would you be looking for? Like these if this, then that type things. So we might have a team who has just one log source, but has only 3 to 6 risk rule generating or risk generating rules, but like one might be 25 and then there's 3 50s and then 2 75s, but that little combination was enough to give them like a better picture of when something might be actually happening. And as far as alerting goes, I showed those examples of those interesting like chained events you can make. And what I thought was really cool was while I was making this slide deck, the Ingenuity team published their attack flow article, which talks basically, I mean, it's a match made in heaven, risk-based alerting and this attack flow stuff, because we've got the asset with properties about the asset, tweaking things, and then the relationship to the action that they're performing. So RBA to me is just a beautiful system for bringing these things together, and I'm really excited to see how the evolution of like complex defense to meet complex attackers sort of evolves through this space. So just to recap what we talked about risk-based alerting, that really cool thing that hopefully you'll be implementing as soon as possible and reducing alert volume for your SOC. And then we talked about how we did that with the collect command to bring together disparate events from other source types into just a shared field language on an abstraction layer. And then we add the risk score and the security metadata that we have about that observation, as well as, and then the tweaking the risk score up and down based on the attributes about the risk object. And then the things we can do now, the possibilities are endless. And I'm actually really excited to talk to people because I know a lot of people are actually doing this in some capacity, but it's just been missing in SIM for a long time. So I've talked to people who see it and they're like, oh, I think I can figure out how to sort of make that happen. And I'm really excited to see that sort of spread through the space and see, the defense game level up. So that's me. And yeah, wow, I went fast. All right.
Simply amazing, simply amazing. And one of the things I really appreciated, and I'm summarizing a lot of the feedback from Slack. You caught a lot of eyes because I think risk is something we all have and we all deal with. But I really loved how you said, you start with your customers, even if they're internal. Like, how do I fit to them? I don't want to piss them off. I don't want them to murder me. How do I really make this a part that they can buy into? So while we give the audience a couple minutes and a couple seconds to maybe think of some questions, just from a quick summary of the Slack, one of the, everyone really loved this, and they were answering questions, asking questions as you were answering them. So it really vibing with that. But I think the big kind of overarching thought was, in your perspective, someone who, maybe hasn't had a lot of experience in this space and they're just getting in, what advice would you give them in terms of, first steps of getting into, really adopting and, not just applying, but, exactly as you said, maintaining and developing this risk approach in their organization?
Yeah, I mean, there's quite a few steps, and I've seen sort of like best practices as far as implementing this, because there are a lot of pieces to think about, and it's also sort of changing the nature of how the whole security operations center, because like you can get red team more involved, you can get so many more teams involved in this. I think it's good to start like talking about what you want to do to the other people you're going to work with, because maybe you can align what you're building like with them early on, so that like when you have this in practice, you not only design it in a way that makes it usable for them, like making sure your SOC should have a process to responding to risk alerts before you just enable risk alerts, because it's a little different of how they're approaching things. So I really think just talking to people, you will get so many ideas while you're talking to people, and then you have to scope what you can actually do and then just build the foundation. But yeah, as far as like content, you can also prioritize content based on what's making a lot of noise for your team, and then covering gaps that you just haven't been able to close before.
I love that. It really does start with the people, because it's a lot of hard problems, a lot of technical problems, but if people aren't bought in and really into what's happening, that makes a lot of sense. So I think we have, I know we're right in front of lunch, so I recognize that, and I know everyone online would, you're probably in a similar boat, but we do have a couple minutes for questions if there's anyone. Oh, a couple. I saw on hand in the back.
How are you going about doing that practice?
So
yeah,
for the live audience, the question was, what going into calculating risk scores and kind of that algorithm, what kind of goes into that, and what is the feedback loop for maintaining and kind of maturing that?
Yeah, so like I said, with like lull bins are a great example, because they're really common activity in your environment. So we could utilize a combination of like impact if that thing were to happen. Like if a recon command happens, that's not a huge impact when it's happening. But if it's happening 1,000 times per day, my confidence in that is really low. So I just generally grouped things by fidelity and just my perception of how bad it would be for this thing to be occurring. And so maybe things later in the chain might have a higher impact. But yeah, we often just would like make our detection logic, see how many results we're getting, and then even like some stuff we might allow list outright just because it is definitely business traffic every time, but then we'd still have thousands of alerts left. We might see how we can slice that into like, what are the things that are generally going to be even lower risk, and what's medium, what's high. So like our proxy rule, we might see malware and phishing, keep those high, suspicious, maybe medium, and uncategorized site was 0, for example. So you can slice it up in ways that make sense.
And that really does get back to what you said earlier about talking to people, like not just initially, but throughout that entire process. So thank you.